What's going on, y'all? I'm KMBest. Let's jump into the tier list for what I am affectionately calling the High Evolutionary metagame. This deck is sort of the patient zero of the High Evolutionary metagame, which really started to form around it. This was the first deck that people really figured out was really good with the High Evolutionary package in it, and it just sort of took off from there because it was not reliant on, if you get Luke Cage, it's just like a minor issue, not a major one. The fundamental premise of this deck is one that got copied to a bunch of other High Evolutionary decks, and it is that you want to win one lane early and then Hulk another lane, and that'll do it, right? And this deck does that more literally than basically any other deck, because what you're doing is literally winning a lane early with Storm or Spiderman, and then hulking a different location. Now, of course, the deck is more complex than that. We can play for all three locations with Dr. Doom. We have a lot of ability to sort of pick and choose what we want to contest, and that is the fundamental strength of the list, that we have a lot of control over how the games play out. Now, in terms of weaknesses, one thing that is very clear is that this list is not very good at dealing with Killmonger. So if you really are afraid of Killmonger, you can take out the Luke Cage, put in an armor, if that's something you want to try. Because Killmonger right now is eating off of this list. Killmonger is in the metagame because this list is so one-cost card reliant, and if you're afraid of that, and you probably should at least be aware of it, because it's not going to farm you, but it will make your job a lot harder, you can consider running armor in here. Next up, Lockjaw High Evolutionary, and Lockjaw High Evo is probably the most consistent, I wouldn't say best deck in the game, but easiest one to recommend by far. There's not a ton that goes into it. It helps you understand snapping a lot more. If you're kind of a new player and you have the cards to play this, I definitely recommend that you do so. It's a great deck for Conquest mode because your snaps and retreats are so easy, and you can get a lot of mileage out of it. I've found it to be a decent amount more frustrating on ladder than in Conquest mode, because in Conquest mode, your snapping matters so much. You can really get some skill expression done with this deck, whereas if you brick a couple games in a row on ladder, it just feels terrible, no matter how you slice it. So I've actually enjoyed this deck more in Conquest. In terms of being a battle mode deck, fundamentally what this deck is doing is actually not very different from the Lockdown deck, because what we're doing is we're scamming a lane early and then we're playing a Hulk somewhere else. It's just that the way we're scamming a lane early is with Lockjaw most of the time. So there's a lot to talk about here, and there will be a video forthcoming on this deck, because I do think it's sort of the pillar of the metagame right now, and you need to understand it at the very least. Even if you don't play it, you need to understand what you can do to beat it. But in terms of, what you can do to beat it, one card that is very, very strong here is Shang-Chi. Now, Shang-Chi is extremely powerful because this deck has absolutely no protection for it, and to run any kind of protection for it would put you in a situation where you are making your Lockjaws worse in the mirror, and right now that's just not worth doing. Now, one great matchup that this deck has is into the Lockdown list. That's actually why this deck gained prominence. You see the inclusion of Killmonger to target that matchup even further, and just the general ability to play towards multiple lanes, the threat of Dr. Doom. You're doing what they're doing, but you're doing it a little bit more unfairly, and that is why you tend to have a good matchup into them. This is an extremely important deck to understand if you plan on trying to go for an infinite conquest, because you will almost certainly run into it at some point during your run. For our third High Evo deck, and thankfully last High Evo deck of this tier list, I did want to talk about the Midrange Evo build, and this is my current preferred build, and I personally think it's my favorite deck to play in the game. I'm not going to say I think it's the best deck in the game. It's what I would default to if I was had to win a game, I have to try hard, I want to play something like this. I think that it has good matchups into both of the previously mentioned decks. Scorpion and Shang-Chi are sort of a specific tech for the Lockjaw list. Scorpion obviously better than Hazmat in that matchup. Shang-Chi obviously unbelievable. And this deck also covers our other bases by running Wave to deal with Kitty Pryde lists, and generally just playing a lot of really strong cards. There is not a single card in this deck that is actually bad. We just get things done consistently across matchups. We have answers, we have threats, we have power, we have everything. And this is the sort of list that really stuck out to me as the canary in the coal mine for, oh man, High Evo might actually be kind of a problem. Because previously, lists like this, all the tech cards, they were the purview of, you know, Zabu and Darkhawk and sometimes Sarah and things like that. And the fact that this ends up just being better is a little bit worrying to me, because it's like, oh, okay, you know, you actually just put all the Evo cards in the tech cards, and it was better than decks that were built to do this specific thing. And I think a lot of that is down to the fact that we have to include Wave. And because we have to include Wave, you know, it's more awkward to include Wave in like a Black Bolt Stature deck for obvious reasons. It's more awkward to include Wave in a Sarah deck for obvious reasons. But because this deck is not reliant on a specific turn 5 play, we're actually able to include Wave pretty profitably, especially if we can pair it with a 2-cost Abomination, which does happen some of the time. And I think that's really what it is, right? It's not that this stuff is actually that much better than the Sarah stuff or the Black Bolt stuff. It's that this can afford to run Wave because it's not relying on a turn 5 play, and that means that it just has a way better matchup against anyone playing any kind of Kitty Pryde, Sarah, whatever, what have you. Any of those decks, it effectively beats the mirror, right? If they're playing like Zabu and Sarah and you wave them, they're dead. If they're playing Black Bolt on turn 5 and you wave them, well, they were expecting to play multiple cards, and now they're not playing multiple cards. And that's sort of why this deck has the edge that it does. It's the same role in the metagame, playing all the tech cards, but it beats those sort of mirrors against the other decks that play all the tech cards. So next up is kind of the only deck that I've found reliably beats High Evolutionary Lockjaw, and it is this teched out version of Bounce. Now, the Shang-Chi is pretty much required. The Elektra is just a little bit of tech against the lockdown version of High Evolutionary to try to make that matchup a little bit better. One thing that you will have to know if you play this list is people are going to wave you, and they're going to snap, and you have to make the decision right then if you can beat the wave by deploying on turn 5. Now, I did just release a video on this list, and I do expect there to be a lot of value in you watching that video from here, so I won't go too in-depth on this, but it is an important list to understand because it is the list that goes over the top, and I have found it very hard to find any kind of other deck that matches up very well into High Evolutionary Lockjaw, short of just running a bunch of Shang-Chis, right? And this is a deck that matches up into Evo Lockjaw. Even when you don't draw the Shang-Chi, you are still able to contest their big guys, and that is just a really, really, really big deal. This is the deck that makes people run Wave. It is the boogeyman hiding in the corner, waiting for people to stop playing the stuff that beats it. Now, one thing that does present a very big risk to you if you play this deck is High Evolutionary Lockdown, Spiderman, and Storm, preventing you from playing all the cards you want to play on the final turn of the game. You have to play really, really well to make those matchups close, and Elektra only makes it close. Elektra does not make that matchup favored for you. It just gets you in with a fighting chance. That's pretty much it. So do be aware of that. This is a deck you pick if you have a very hard read that you are like only going to run into High Evolutionary Lockjaw. If that's what you want, you will win those matchups. I have had a shocking amount of success with Electro Ramp, and I'm really not sure why, other than that people just aren't ready for it, and you get like a reasonably large amount of power. Like, your good draws can compete with a Lockjaw's good draws, and your bad draws, you know, they can't, but so they also brick, right? And you have a lot more control over what actually happens in the game. Like, generally, I think they have a little bit of a higher power ceiling, especially if they're running the Infinite. But if they're not running the Infinite, you're really kind of doing similar stuff. And you'd think that Sandman would be super bad there, but it's like okay enough to prevent them from free rolling 0-cost cards into the Lockjaw. Wave does a sort of similar thing. It's not going to come up a lot, but you can use it for that. And of course, you have an absolute free matchup against any of the decks that really want to be playing a lot of cards on the final turn of the game, or even really more than one. They find it hard to deal with a Sandman. They find it hard to deal with a turn 5 Wave. Locking them down does do a lot here. You also have a ton of ability to play for 3 lanes. So keep in mind that you can do things like, you know, Black Panther Arnim Zola, or Black Panther Odin, Dr. Doom Odin Panther all on the same lane is something that I've done before. You have just a ton of ability to be unpredictable with where your power is actually going. That's pretty good into the Storm decks too. So I think this deck is genuinely a little bit of a sleeper. I've really enjoyed playing it, and I think it definitely deserves a second look here in terms of, oh, wait, is this just a better way, a more efficient way to play our giant big guys strategy? So I have been genuinely pretty surprised by this. I've had some really, really, really good games with it. And while I do think it might be a little bit below the others in terms of power, I'm not actually sure. And I do think this deck bears some real investigation going forward. So a lot of people ask me why I don't include Sarah on my lists a lot. And I think a lot of it is that I think the High Evolutionary tech deck is kind of just doing what Sarah does, but better and without losing to Wave. And this deck is sort of in a similar vein. Now, I think this is just what we have to do to make this deck good. And what you're seeing here is the inclusion of Killmonger for the High Evolutionary Lockdown matchups, the inclusion of Shang-Chi for the High Evolutionary Lockjaw matchups, and not playing Sarah at all, and instead playing just Black Bolt Stature, which is just better Sarah. That's pretty much the idea. We have Jeff to discount Miles as well. We're getting more stats than the Sarah deck. We do lose Hitmonkey, but we are better able to play into Wave. And I think more than that, we have like our little copium plan of Zabu into Rock Slide against Lockjaw decks. Like, we have some real game in that matchup. It's a little bit cope, but it's definitely like a matchup we can reasonably win. Now, there are other versions of this list with Iron Lad and Dr. Doom in them. I'm playing the very basic version here, but I see no problems with those decks. If you want to try to make this deck more expensive, cut the miles, play Iron Lad, Doom, stuff like that, the world is yours. I have played this pretty conservatively, and because of that, like the inclusion of Killmonger, things like that, I want to play a bit more reactively rather than proactively with a list like this. And so I've played for the sort of conservative, more consistent version of this deck. That's what you're seeing on the screen right now. I do think that this occupies a very similar metagame space to the High Evolutionary Midrange deck. And I think the comparison between these two is a little bit what worries me, because if the Evo Midrange deck is better at its job than this deck, that is really problematic. And a lot of that, again, is down to the fact that we want to play a card on 5 that is not Wave. And putting Wave in this deck makes it significantly worse. And so we just say, you know what? All right, Kitty Pryde, you're going to beat us. It's fine. No one's going to play Bounce. That is what it is. We're going to have good, fair matchups into every other deck. And I think that's a, reasonable thing to say, but why would you do that when you could play the Evo version, which actually does get to run Wave and farm Kitty Pryde anyway, right? That's what I have trouble wrapping my head around. And to be clear, I think this deck is better Sarah. And like, what does that say about Sarah? I did want to wrap this up by talking about my vision of the overall metagame right now, because the way I see it, there's Evo Lockdown, there's Evo Lockjaw, and then there's decks that play Killmonger and Shang-Chi to deal with those decks. And that's pretty much what we're looking at, right? There's Kitty Pryde, which sort of goes tall as tall can, and then it's pretty much just that. Like, it's those two decks, and then it's decks that are angling to beat them with, some degree of success. And I'm not saying it's impossible to beat them. Obviously, I think Kitty Pryde is good into them. I think plenty of decks have game into them, but whether or not they have game into them and whether or not they reliably beat them are two kind of different things. And I do think that we're getting to the point where, especially with the High Evo mid-range list, I am becoming a little bit worried that he's just a little bit too good at everything. The card High Evolutionary, the cards that he creates, might just be a little bit too good at pretty much everything that they do. And I think one really good way to start toning that down would be to make it so Wasp only hits one thing. I mean, I think it's pretty clear to me that Wasp and Hulk are the straws that stir the drink, but Cyclops should not go unmentioned. That is an unbelievable card as well. There's a lot of power in that shell, and it seems to have pushed all the other sort of good cards shells aside in various contexts. And it's really interesting to me to see that happen, because we've gone from playing like Thanos Lockjaw to just playing High Evolutionary Lockjaw, 12 cards, our Lockjaw is better now, right? Like, it's a really interesting metagame evolution. I don't mind it. I do think there are going to be people who complain, High Evolutionary, it's pay to win, things like that. And I think more or less, that's like a reasonable critique. Like, it's pretty hard to make a lot of the decks that I just showed you unless you buy High Evolutionary, right? So first of all, if you're playing on a budget, my advice to you would be to buy High Evolutionary if you can, and then go towards getting Wasp and Wave and Doctor Doom. You play the High Evo Midrange deck. You have purchased cards that are basically always going to be really good, with the possible exception of Wasp if they nerf her High Evo form. And you should be good to go from there. And I think you can build there. You can build toward the Lockjaw deck. You can build toward the Lockdown deck from there. You can have so many of the best decks in the game with just that card. Now, that said, I do sort of wonder, you know, if a nerf is not coming, just because, like, you look at what this is, you look at this meta, it's very, very rotating around Evolutionary. So let me know in the comments if you think Evo is OP or too good, or what you would do to change it, if you have any suggestions for that. As always, I've been KMBest. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one. Thanks again. Have a good one.